This is Michael Woodward, and this is episode 72 of the Jumblethink podcast.
T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Jumblethink podcast, a podcast focused on telling the stories of people with big dreams, just like you. Along the way, we give you some tips and ideas of how you can chase your own big idea and dream and create the world you want to live in. Our guest on today's episode is Yoon. More about Eddie in a moment. Our guest on Monday's episode is Michael Gebbin. He is the founder and CEO of Jumpstarters. He's worked with people like Tony Robbins, Pat Flynn, Tim Ferriss, and Richard Branson. It's a fun episode. We go deep into getting out of being trapped or feeling like you're in a cage, but that you can start leading the life you want to live, chasing that big idea and dream. We talk about successes and failures and how you can really start creating something awesome. So make sure to check out that episode with Michael Gebbin on Monday. We believe that everyone was created for purpose and destiny. And sometimes when you have a big idea and dream, it can be scary. You may have all kinds of obstacles in your way. It could be funding, it could be fear, it could be isolation, it could be doubt, and so many other obstacles that hold you back from reaching your potential. You don't have to go it alone. Jumblethink is here to help you. Drop us an email, hello@jumblethink.com. We check every email and we respond to everyone we hear from. Can't wait to hear from you and help you on your journey to reaching that big idea. Now let's jump into today's episode with Yoon. Our guest on the podcast today is Yoon. He is a specialist in growth strategies and the founder of EDDIEWOULDGROW. EDDIEWOULDGROW is a think tank and advisory firm on growth strategy. He's also been a keynote speaker all over the world. And for 18 years, he was a partner at the Cambridge Group, which specializes in strategy consulting for CEOs and senior leadership in Fortune 1000 companies. He's also been featured on Harvard Business Review, Inc. magazine, and MSNBC. You can check out Eddie at eddiewoulldgrow.net. Let's jump into our conversation with Yoon. I love what you're doing, so it's going to be a lot of fun to chat with you today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. I'm super excited to be here.
You are in the world of growth, which is in the business world, I think what every business is looking for. We want to grow the business. We want to grow the business. We want to grow the business. How did you get into this space? Because you've been doing it for a while.
Yeah, it was kind of by accident. So, you kind of find that life is a series of accidents that are hard to anticipate. So I came out of college and wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do. And a good friend of mine was saying, hey, let's try this consulting thing while, we figure it out. And so I did that. And my first consulting assignment, I did the merger between Price Waterhouse and Coopers and Lybrand.
Oh, wow.
Which was really interesting. And, as a young 21, 22-year-old, it was great fun. I was traveling the world and then, learning about professional services firms. And it was, I felt really good about the work, which I did that project for maybe 2 years. And then Sarbanes-Oxley happened and they basically forced all these accounting firms to spin out consulting. And
wow.
I was a little like, well, what was the point of everything that I just did? Does my life have meaning now or my career with it? And it was interesting that I had a colleague leave where I started out and come to Cambridge. And, she knew kind of where my head was at. And she said, well, why don't you try this side of consulting? It's strategy versus execution. So at least, you're not the caboose, but you'll be the front of the train. And then secondly, it's about consumers. And so anything consumer facing, be it packaged goods like food or personal care or retail or media. And the growth side of things was really the part that I felt like was appealing. And, I think A, because I could relate, and B, like my parents are immigrants. And so, I could at least explain to them what I was doing. They're like, well, okay, I'm not exactly sure what he's doing, but I understand the products and the brands that he's working with and stuff. And that's kind of where I've been. And it's been fun. Like, I think a lot of consulting, when you stay in it long enough, you kind of get further and further pigeonholed, because that's how you can be successful, is to become the world's expert in distribution for, pin needles and the like, which may not be that fulfilling at the end of the journey. And I find that growth is like there's expertise to be developed, but it's not always the same. And so growing one thing, like I remember I did 2 consecutive projects, one in hot dogs and one in sausages. And you would imagine that they were very similar kind of meat and buns that you grill. And they were completely different in terms of how you would grow them. And I was like, wow, I'm really hooked on this. This is really cool.
How does significance and purpose play into what you're doing and fulfill you in your journey?
It's a great question, Mike, because I'd actually written a piece about this in HBR about, basically the idea that all work should have meaning and can have meaning in it that's positive, unless you're like a heroin dealer, which is not a good thing and stuff. But I think there are a few jobs that are universally bad. But I think for me, it was I lucked out because, every growth strategy doesn't always result in a really huge home run in the marketplace, even though it should. And that's my aspiration. But like the joy of when you're working with a client or a company and they are growing as a result of what you did, that's just fantastic. And like, I'm trying to think of like, whenever people come to me for business advice about should I change jobs or careers, I always say just pick an industry that at least has a strong tailwind behind it, because it's so much fun to be part of a place that's growing and they're investing. And no matter how good your job is, it's not fun at all when it's shrinking and declining and you have to cut in costs with it there. So I think there's something inherent about being part of something that has momentum and growth that I think is really good at the macro level. Like that's just a fun place to be, and that's fulfilling, and you're creating jobs and opportunities and whatnot. The second thing that I give, if I go a little more micro, is that at some level, what I do is kind of help people see eye to eye, consumers and the companies and their investors, in terms of where the win-win-win is. And what I mean by that is, there's always people assume that sales and demand are the same thing. This is another article that I'd written about. And so if I sold, $1 million worth of X product last year, that means that there's $1 million worth of demand that's out there. And what I find really fascinating is that sometimes there's nothing farther from the truth of that, right? That's just what was available and I didn't like it, but I was forced to buy it and therefore it's there. Or maybe it was all right, but I just have a temporary situation where I needed it and I'm not going to have it next year, so you can't rely on that going forward. And so I think at some level is helping companies understand that there are some people for whom every category just means a lot more to them than the average person. They're not a here fly by the night consumer. They're going to be here yesterday and won't be here tomorrow. It's because they have an inherent love and passion for it, and they spend behind it. And when you kind of understand the people who have passion and are really profitable, these are the folks I call super consumers, then there's a lot of kind of eye to eye connections that you can make that not only are you making somebody who's really into something much happier because you're listening to them and understand what the opportunity is, but beyond that, you're making the company and the executives much more excited because they have an opportunity. It's not just about, am I going to make my numbers next quarter or not? There's a real joy that comes with, I think I have an idea of how to go forward with it versus just kind of throwing stuff against the wall. So there's kind of this joy is prevalent when you're growing at the macro level, and that's what I really find meaning in. And at the very micro level, it's the level of empathy and respect that you have for another human being who cares quite a bit about the category, and you're trying to make what you do better for them. There's something very personal and I think powerful about that as well too.
You mentioned, finding a space that's having growth, that's having kind of its breakout moment, whether that's at a macro or a micro level, and how that kind of helps energize the journey. You wrote an interesting article in Inc. magazine about fad versus like sustainable product or sustainable business and the 20-20-20 rule. Can you tell us about that and what that means and how we can, as business owners or creatives or CEOs, really come in and identify when something has sustaining power versus something that just looks really cool and then all of a sudden it's gone?
Yeah, no, it's the 20-20-20 rule is something that I just kind of as I was thinking about after 18 years of doing growth strategy at the Cambridge Group, and like I've just seen patterns across the clients that have driven billions of dollars worth of growth, and it's really kind of three things. One is, does 20% of the people in the category have this unmet need? And it's not a hard and fast rule, but what I find is that a lot of companies are trying to solve for everybody. And, it's the age old adage of if you try to be everything to everybody, then you won't be anything to anyone.
Right.
And so 20% it's always been the right, range of numbers where it's not everybody, so that you actually have a point of view, and it should actually turn people off in the category, right? That's the hallmark of, I have an idea that is really powerful and compelling to some and a complete turnoff to other people. That's a very good thing.
It causes like a really deep reaction where people either love it or hate it. It's absolute.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's really, it's the opposite of passion is not hate, it's indifference, right? And that's what you're trying to avoid is indifference. And then so the other bit is, if you're too small, if you're like 2% of the market, then it's hard to be scalable at some level or hard to attract investment. It's not to say that if you have a business plan that is meant to be small and niche, that it can't work. But what I find is that if you kind of look for that 20% rule, then you're in a really good spot where you have a point of view and it matters to some and is, unattractive to others, but it's actually reasonably scalable. That, if you think about, Apple as, a hugely successful company, but also the fact that at one point they had only 9% of smartphone units and over 100% of the category profit. Like, you don't need to be huge, right?
Right.
In terms of like getting everybody to have a huge business with it. So that's the first 20% rule, is that part of it there. So the second thing, 20 is it should be a 20-year trajectory or history behind it. And this is the really important part of like, is this a short-term thing or will this be here to last? Is if you kind of take a step back from what the technology is or what the product is, and you pull the lens back and say, is this something that has it been going on for some time now, and will it go on going forward? And so Keurig is a great example of this, where I have a number of friends in the coffee category and some very big companies. They're just now kind of rolling out products for Keurig, even though it's been a thing and a phenomenon for years, right?
Right.
And partly they avoided doing anything about it because they were fearful that it was a fad.
Okay.
And one of the things that I was able to say to folks is like, you could have probably seen this 8 years ago that this was a thing from a couple of ways. One is that, super consumers of coffee were in on this early, right? And their share of throat or share of wallet, as it were, was much higher in this earlier on than not. And so, there are canaries in the coal mine that you can use to see that, these early adopters, or however you want to call them, they're in on it early. Or some parts of the market of the country are in on it early, right? So craft beer is another good one of, people were like, oh, craft beer is going to be a thing. And it's like, the Pac Northwest has been on it for a while. Parts of the Northeast have been on it for a while. Like, if you can see that there are some markets in your category that are, again, these early warning systems that can predict the future of the rest of the market, then that's important to note. And then the last bit is just this idea of, would I bet, I call it the generational bet, right? Is the idea of coffee. I have 3 children, 9, 11, and 13. Okay. And they're not coffee drinkers, obviously, now. But when they become adults, do I believe that they will, be using the old filtered coffee and the grounds or would they be using a single serve system like this? I would push all the money that I have into, more. My kids will not know how to make a traditional pot of coffee going forward, right?
Okay, yeah.
And that's 20-year generational demand that you feel really good about. So then when they have 20 million households now in the system for Keurig, and there's 90 million households that have a coffee machine. To me, it's not to say that Keurig is going to be the winner, but that single serve on demand coffee that has infinite variety, which a lot of what tech companies do very well, like that value proposition is not going away, and that there's no way that my kids would ever settle for less. It'd be like going back to linear TV versus having Netflix and the like. Like, these are things that you can just bet on from that time period. And so when that's the middle 20, and then the last 20 is I actually alluded to it earlier, is yeah, a lot of these trends and growth happen in the top 20 cities in a local market oftentimes. And so in that, if you can actually validate it there, so that like the two words that I hate most in business are national average, because I just think it's just it peanut butters the great nooks and crannies of data that are really valuable, which is to say that, you know, not everyone in America consumes exactly the same thing the same way at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And that, you know, like a lot of the global companies that I work with, they care so much about the nuances between a Belgium and a Luxembourg and a Parisian consumer, and yet, you know, they treat the U.S. as like, it's just all the same here, right? But, you know, the local market nuances from Austin to Annapolis, like they're so different. And if you can see that these trends are happening at a local level, not only does it validate that it's a thing, but secondarily, it tells you very specifically where and what you should be doing, which is super powerful as well, too.
It almost sounds like with that last space there that you can even use those markers as early identifiers of trends that are going forward, where instead of waiting for a national growth spurt where you go, oh, single serve coffee is going to be such a big space, you could be looking at these micro economies within it. I mean, California itself is such a significant market share of the entire U.S. market share that you could just look at California or L.A. or Southern California as indicators for nationwide growth on a product.
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely think that's true. And that you raise a great point, Mike, about California. And like I always say that big companies that I've worked with over the years, you can tell kind of like the investment community would do well just to see, hey, big company, do you have a California problem or not? Right? I mean, like so many big companies have a California problem, and not only is that a sign of trouble for those companies to come, whether it's, if you're a big three auto manufacturer and you go to California, you're like, wait, where are my brands here? They're not existing. Or in big food. But I think, Mike, to your same point, it's the same thing of what's growing in LA, what's growing in the Bay Area, what's growing in Santa Cruz and the like. And so this ability to look at a much more nuanced level, it actually is a pretty decisive advantage for smaller companies who are willing to be more nimble on that. But I think it's just the whole thing of like, if you can, I think if your back's against the wall and you got to make a quick decision, this 20-20-20 rule I find is a super helpful way to make a decision and feel good about it without having very much data or very much time at all.
I want to step back and kind of dive a little bit deeper into something that you've referenced several times, and people might not completely understand what it means. So much of the marketing world focuses on brand strategy. Oh, what's the brand of BMW? What's the brand of McDonald's? What's the brand of Apple? And they use that as the marketing, as the positioning, as the growth strategy.
Yeah.
But you talk about, we really need to move away from a brand strategy, although brand is significant and it's part of that, but move more into a category strategy. What is category? And then how do we create strategy around it?
Yeah, it's interesting. This notion of, what have you, just looking at history as what we did yesterday, the year before, or even 10 years ago. Because I think that exactly to what you just said, Mike, is that there's too many companies that I run into that this is the way that I would describe it. They worship at the altar of their brands, and they believe that their brands are the end all be all, and they are a big advantage, and they can be. But it's what I find now is that the basis of competition is wildly different, right? And so back in the day, in the 1950s, in the kind of Leave It to Beaver world, where you had 3 channels and only a handful of places to shop and a limited set of choices of what you could buy, there was a lot more demand than you had options to choose from. And therefore, your brand mattered to some degree. But then in a world now where it's so much easier to have choice from a consumer standpoint, or even in a B2B standpoint of like, do I go with one enterprise software or Salesforce.com or the next Salesforce.com out there? And that when you face an abundance of choice, then brands matter less. When you have perfect information, like brands are really important when you didn't really have the ability to research something and you had to trust in the company. And with information and reviews now, that advantage goes away. With media fragmentation, it's harder to talk to people in a way that on your terms, and that marketing, I find, has kind of evolved from what I would say are monologues where brands would kind of shout at consumers and consumers are just kind of captive there listening. And then now with social media, it's more of a duet, right? So they're consumers are talking back at brands on their own terms in their own ways. And then thirdly, what people seem to miss is this idea of what I view as the marketing of going forward and brand strategy, which should be a three-way conversation. It should be a super consumer convincing someone who is a potential super consumer to get into the category, right? So a surfer trying to convince a wannabe surfer to really go out and buy the equipment and gear and really get after it. And a brand listening in at the same time is kind of the way that I think marketing is going to evolve to be more effective. And the reason being is that, so many companies compete more against people like Apple than you realize. Even if you're not in the smartphone or computer or laptop or tablet business, it's because a lot of brands have become wants versus needs. And when there's rumors of $1,000 iPhone, where's that money coming from? It's going to come out of the disposable spend of people who might have gone out to eat or might have gotten a bar of chocolate or might have bought some clothing with it there, right? And that the things that I think are occurring is that really what's happening when I see a brand that is not relevant anymore, in general, what I see is a category that's not really relevant is the main thing.
Okay.
Is at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right. And so, Big Food lost $4 billion worth of market share, and they're spending trying to, against the brands to make them more relevant again. And it's like, well, what does it matter when you see that in 2015, the lines finally crossed and consumers in America have started to spend more money eating out than eating in? Like that trend is really hard to reverse, right?
Yeah.
You can't do anything about that. And your individual brand of cereal, like that really doesn't matter if the tide is turned in a dramatic way. And therefore, what you have to refigure out is, how do you make the category more relevant? And like what I find is from a category strategy, you have kind of 8 different levers, 4 on the consumer side or customer side and 4 on the business model side. So on the consumer side, you have kind of your brand, as it were, right? Your product, the experience you deliver, and the price. And even in that scenario, I'm like, brand is just 1 out of 4 levers that you can pull to be relevant there. And on the business model side, you have, the manufacturing, how you make it, distribution, how you, move it, marketing, how you talk to people about it, and then, the profit model, how you make money. Like there's 4 different levers that you could pull that have nothing to do with your brand necessarily. And that the companies that are some of the biggest branded players, like what they forget is that the way they got to be dominant in the first place was through business model innovation and category innovation, right? Like a lot of these major food brands that are struggling to make their brands relevant, they forget that back in the day, frozen foods didn't exist, and it was an art of food science and technology that got frozen foods and frozen distribution to the point where frozen foods were viable there with it, right? The same thing with the beer industry. The big beer brands are struggling with craft beers, and they forget that back in the day, it was all draft beer in barrels, and then someone innovated, bottles and cans, right? And the things that we forget that you talk about your role in technology is that how much these other levers beyond your brand really, really matter at the end of the day. Like with Amazon now buying Whole Foods, everyone thinks that that's going to be the thing, and the Whole Food brand is important, and it is. But they are investing in other food science. There's a thing called MATS, microwave-assisted thermal sterilization, that I can geek out a little bit on if you want to. But basically, it's going to change the nature of the way that food remains safe to eat for longer periods of time. It's going to exponentially increase shelf stability. And, Amazon's big kind of Achilles heel has been, they're never going to win in grocery. You can't ship food. It's perishable. Well, what happens if the perishability part of it goes away?
Right.
What happens when, now that plus drones plus the Whole Foods brands, like, there's a lot scarier things that are out there that I think people have to deal with, that no matter how good your brand is, if the category is fundamentally flawed, then you got problems that your brand can't fix. And that's kind of why I'm kind of harping on this whole thing around the category strategy. First and foremost, make sure that that's not the real problem, right? Because otherwise you're going to put a Band-Aid on a amputated leg there.
Yeah. Well, and I think that raises a good question, because we've had lots of guests on. And I think back to different episodes, and I think back to one that was in the fashion world, and she moved from making handbags to making cosmetics and other items in that same space, but items that weren't on a downward trajectory. And I also talked to another fashion industry. We're talking about Amazon and the death of retail and what that means and everything like that. As business owners, whether it's a small business, whether it's a big corporation, how can we not get so entrenched in riding the wave till it's dead and really have the foresight to see what's coming? To see where we need to make the shifts, where we need to go. Yeah. Well, this space isn't working anymore, but this is in the same realm, but the category's still growing. The category's still got life in it. It's got a future for the next 20 years, 40 years. How can businesses really start, instead of seeing what's right in front of them, have that broader picture and foresight to know what choices they need to make?
Yeah, the two things that I would suggest that businesses do, one is throw out your brand plan and have a category plan. And specifically, you need a vision to double your category. And that sounds kind of preposterous. And, like, well, how am I going to, I'm make it up, double the Kleenex market, as it were, right?
Yeah.
And, but what it really is it's an important thought exercise of, if you had unlimited resources, how would you do it? Is it in fact possible, even if you had the resources that were unlimited? And if you can't figure out how to do it, then why would I give you a single dollar right now in the first place, right? And so the category doubling strategy and the plan there, it's three levers, right? You can double the number of consumers in the category, you can double the units per consumer, or you can double the price per unit, or some combination of the three that are there. And you don't have to do all three, but what I'll tell you is that exercise forces people to say, is there life in this category yet still? How would I convince someone not in the category to actually come into the category? How would I convince existing people to double their current spending on it, be it units or pricing with it there? And what I find is that one of a couple things happens, right? Is that some people kind of say, okay, fine, I can see a whole path to non-consumers of XYZ. So like when Anheuser-Busch launched Bud Light Lime, a lot of the beer hardcore people made fun of it, but it's really a strategy to pull people back into beer, because wine and spirits have been growing and in particular are closer to 60-40 male-female, whereas beer is more 80-20 male-female.
Yeah.
And that Bud Light Lime is meant to bring back women into the category. And so it was wildly successful, $500 million in year two, but also the most incremental thing that they launched, because specifically it was designed to bring new people in. And it had the nice benefit, it was a nice price premium as well too there, right? And that if they can do it, then others can as well too. And so if you one outcome is you have a category doubling strategy, and that's great, you can go pursue it and figure out how to make your way there. Now, if you can't figure it out, then that's where, like, your friend in the fashion industry, it's like, okay, maybe it's time to cut bait and move on. The thing that I find is that one of the things in my research around Superconsumers with Cambridge was part of Nielsen. And so I had access to big data there, was if you were a super consumer of one category, you were a super consumer of 9 others, some of which were obviously related and some of which were not. And that actually makes for a very nice migration category-wise into other things you could do, right? So there are one of my favorites is, if you are a super consumer of milk, then what else are you a super consumer of? And a lot of people would imagine, well, milk is dairy, dairy's healthy, and therefore you're probably eating a lot of vegetables and other healthy things that are there. And what we found was that a super consumer of milk, which is to say you were buying, soy milk and almond milk and organic milk, not just a lot of milk, but expensive milk, that you were also a super consumer of cereal, which kind of makes sense, but also cookies, candy, and a lot of other junk food that was out there. And we were like, okay, what's going on here? And what it turns out was these people were using milk a little bit like a Catholic indulgence back in the day of, like, if I drink this really expensive organic milk and that's really good for me, then I can indulge in another cookie or another candy bar or whatnot there, right? And people are just endlessly interesting in that you don't want to make assumptions about them. But another one that I saw was Generac is the leading manufacturer of standby generators, which is, it's a hard sell, Mike. Like to sell this product, it's like $7,000 to $10,000 or more. And I'd be going to you and saying, and you might be aware of it because you're in the Northeast, but like, hey, let me tell you about this product that's super expensive that you've never heard of for a need you may never have, right? Which is like when the power goes out and you need to kick in. But what they found were that there are people who were buying them proactively. These were their versions of Superconsumers, because not like you're going to buy multiple generators, but these people had 2 to 3 times more life insurance than they needed. They were super consumers of vitamins, and they were super consumers of refrigerators and freezers. Like they had multiple ones of them in their home. And they're kind of, you pull the lens back and you're like, oh, these are kind of proactive protection, Boy Scouts, be prepared for the worst case scenario type folk, right? And if you can actually, I'm not saying that if you're in the life insurance business, you should move into vitamins and stuff, but it creates a different path forward that you might say, you know what, there are categories that are fairly closely related to what I do, maybe a radically different supply chain and a radically different business model and brand, but I might have some interesting insights about what else I could do. I might, it's easier to sell to your existing consumers than to find entirely new ones, and that's an easier way to make a transition. Or frankly, I might have new partners that I might be able to tap into than I realized. And so, could you imagine a vitamin CEO calling up an insurance CEO and say, "Let's share data"? It seems kind of silly until you realize that maybe there's a there to it, right? Right. And that you can monetize your assets in a way that you haven't been able to take advantage of there.
Well, in our space, we do something similar with message mapping, where we take and we go through, go down the rabbit hole of exploring how messages can be communicated in non-traditional ways. And a lot of what you're saying is saying, what are the things we're not seeing? What are the things that we may assume and our assumptions are wrong? But as we go down that bunny hole, we find life insurance and vitamins might have a coexistence together in a way that we didn't foresee.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think it's a huge opportunity that most people aren't thinking about. And, why would you? Like, how would you have ever gotten to that conclusion until you realize that, consumers, a lot of it might comes down to how you treat your customers and consumers, right? Like, do you... And at some level, it's natural to assume that people like, oh, I make pens, and therefore I only think about my people in the context of pens. But I've yet to meet someone whose life entirely consisted of buying and shopping for and using pens all day. Like, they buy other stuff too, right? Yeah. And that if you see someone in the holistic 360 version of their lives, then, it's a better... it's like how you would treat a friend. Like, you would never treat a friend as just unidimensional. And I think the more that people start to treat the people who buy from them as, holistic, real people, and treat them as relationships versus transactions, then these insights tend to fall off the bone a lot better there.
We've been talking about data. We've been talking about micro versus national and mega economies. How can we make decisions based on what data isn't telling us? We talked about the world of like big data. You were mentioning there what it tells us, but there's a lot that data doesn't tell us, or the data that we have isn't a good picture of the reality. How can we go beyond data to make decisions in growth strategy?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I always talk about is how stories now are the new currency for growth. Yeah. And this idea, certainly data is important, but one of the things that I find is the easiest thing to do to start with this idea of super consumers is just look for them around you. Like, you more than not, people I find know super consumers of their category in their friends and family, or even in their organizations and stuff. So just find a couple of them. And then the next thing that I say is that a super consumer, they're not born that way. They kind of evolve that way, and therefore they have an origin story to find out. And so every super consumer kind of walks through 5 stages of development, from I was a non-consumer, I don't have a need for that category, to something happened in my life and now I need the product. And so I'm a light user of the category, but nothing more than that. And then you might actually find that you like the category. That's the 3rd stage. And then if you start to knock on the door of super consumer ness, is the stage 4 is like, I can use this category for a completely different use case than I'd ever imagined. And then the fifth one is I love this category and I'm evangelizing it to other people because it's made my life so much better, right? And then that origin story I have found, no matter if it's in financial services or, cheese or life insurance, like it happens kind of in a very similar fashion.
Right.
And that if you actually took the time, and most people, when they talk to customers or consumers, they have very specific questions that they're asking. They're not asking to hear an open-ended story like this. Like this would be considered oftentimes a waste of time versus like, do you like my new packaging or do you like my new ad? Right. And so take the time and over coffee, over a beer, over a meal, or whatever you need to do, because like frankly, these people they're into the category, so they're happy to talk about it. But find their origin story. And the next part is to find out, the nuggets that you get from the origin story. Are there other people who, if you shared that story with them, they would resonate with it? And where do people fall out on that journey, and what could you actually do about it? And that if I lived in a world without data, that's how I would grow my business. I would find a couple of people who, consume insane amounts of my category. And I would say, tell me your story. And it's usually a fantastic ride. Like it's really, really, I've yet to find one that's not interesting at all. And so it's fun, it's interesting. And then within those narratives of that journey, which may be nonlinear, you will find some parts of it resonate with a lot of other people. And that's your opportunity to really grow your business. And so the example that I give is like Velveeta, was I'd written about in an HBR magazine, which is a very polarizing cheese, right?
Yeah.
And so you either love it because you're used to using it for queso and rotel and Super Bowl, or you're like, I would never go near something that's shelf stable. Cheese is supposed to be refrigerated. It's supposed to be from Europe and blah, 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 right? But what you find is that the journey of the people who are super consumers of Velveeta, they're not like people with tons of money. They're not people who have 9 Super Bowl parties. They're people who have figured out new use cases for it. And that the one that they figured out was, you know what, this is the best melting cheese, bar none. Like there's no fancy cheese out there. Some may taste better, some may are different textures, but this is the best melt. And if I need to get my kids to eat broccoli, this is the cheese to use, because they won't eat broccoli on their own. And that because this melts particularly well, the cheese, the Velveeta, gets into every nook and cranny of the broccoli stalk there. And if I dump shredded cheese on it or a slice of cheese on it, it would look silly and unappetizing, right? And so in order to get my kids to eat more broccoli, I use Velveeta. And that is the reason why I am a Velveeta super consumer. And so you take that insight and that story and you take it to other people, some of whom might have said, I would never buy Velveeta. And then you say to them, do your kids eat as many vegetables as you would like them to do? And most people's hands would go up. Is it easy, or do you have a way of getting them to do that? They would say no. And then you say, if you could get your kids to eat more vegetables, would you buy Velveeta if you use it for this particular use case? It's a wildly different growth strategy than, hey, why don't you throw another Super Bowl party and have Velveeta? Or, you know what, it's okay that it's refrigerated. And and that story, as silly as it is for a Velveeta, I have found exists category by category all over the place there.
You're talking about the super consumer and other names that I've heard tossed around that people might identify that as maybe the brand advocate or the brand evangelists out there. I think of Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, and he talks about the different kinds of consumers and when you're building a brand, of course, he's coming from the brand's side of things, how you can engage them. When you think of a brand super consumer or just a super consumer, how can you convert them into that evangelist for you? Or are they already in that space and you just need to identify them to help support them so they can support your company?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because like most people don't have a live database of category super consumers that they have readily available to them, or maybe it's not maybe they're not aware of it. But you do. Here's the data that you have, right? You have the people who buy your stuff, and potentially you might have data that people who buy your stuff a lot. And maybe they've advocated for you, or they've liked your Facebook page, or there's some sort of indicator that there's an emotional attachment to there. The thing that I always say there is find the brand advocates that you have, because you don't need that many. You just need a few because they have an outsized impact. But the important part is to separate them into two groups. There are brand advocates and evangelists that are also category super consumers, which is to say, the simple question that you ask is, hey, Mike, you are my brand evangelist. You love my brand. Are there other brands in the category that you also feel similarly towards?
Okay.
Right? That you're also evangelizing. And, if they say yes, a lot of brands will feel threatened by that, but those are your best friends.
Yeah.
Because they love you, but they love other people. And so what it ends up happening is that they're smarter as a result of it. And they're going to tell you, they have the ability to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The moment you lose your way, if they are consuming somebody else's brands and products, they will tell you specifically why they have shifted away. And in fact, I mentioned the canary in the coal mine. Like, these are the folks you got to keep tabs on. The moment that they start to find another brand that's interesting, you got to be asking questions. And importantly, the moment that they find another category that they find even more compelling, that's another important question to ask for. Now, the other group of people, brand evangelists and advocates, that just like you, they're monogamous, as it were, and they don't buy other brands. Like, you, of course, you love them, you welcome them, but you're not going to learn a ton from them. And so, it's a little bit like a politician who has a lot of yes men and sycophants around them. Like, it feels great, but you are really being set up for failure because it's very easy to be blindsided regarding that. And so, again, you don't reject them, but you take their comments and advice with a grain of salt. And that the former group is the one that you actually learn from there. And so the important part is, how do you find more? The way that you find more is listening to the first group, figuring out, not judging, but figuring out why you go to other brands instead of me from time to time. And why do you love the category? And why might you be migrating to other categories? And using that insight to actually find people who want to be like them. Because that's actually the part. Nothing gives these category supers more joy than to share their joy of the category and love with other people.
Yeah.
And like I always say, like, I've met tequila super consumers, and they're fantastic. And there's people who, like, 2 to 3 times more of people who want to be tequila super consumers. Like, they have that same desire, but they're not yet spending. And the reason why is they don't know what to do. Like, they are confused by añejo and blanco and reposado blends, and they're kind of stuck with a margarita in hand. Like, I have no idea how to get from A to B.
Yeah.
And a tequila super consumer is the best way to hold their hand and say, hey, this is how you do it. Let me show you what works for me. And voila, you've converted somebody over that way. Like, that's the way that I think marketing is supposed to head towards, is, equipping supers to connect with potential super consumers and let them do your work for you and celebrate them on the journey. Like, convincing somebody who doesn't drink tequila at all to enter the category is actually harder than it is to convince someone who's already doing it but wants to do more and doesn't know how.
Well, and it sounds like what you're saying is really getting on a strategy that converts non-consumers, or people that are interested and want to be passionate but can't, and converting them into kind of like sideline fans into the super consumers.
Yes. It's the easiest, like, layup that you can have there, because they're right there, they're ready, and they're just either they're confused, they might be a little scared, or maybe there's an innovation problem that's there, right? It's like, well, I'd like to do it, but you only come in huge sizes, and the commitment to do so is ginormous, right? And so I'm not going to jump in unless you find an easier way for me to try it out with it. And what I say is that if super consumers tend to be about 10% of the category in terms of people, the potential super consumers tend to be 20 to 30% of the category. And so it's actually something that is really, they're a sizable population. And you just got to find people who are their level of affinity, emotion, and affection for the category exceeds the current spending, and that's how you convince them. And actually, what's interesting is that they tend to be around other super consumers. So, like, one of the findings that I found data-wise was this phenomenon that I call super geos, or super geographies, and that birds of a feather flock together, right? So, if you have market A with 10 super consumers, and market B that also has 10 super consumers, but market A, the 10 supers all know each other, or they're connected some way somehow, that everybody else in market A spends a lot more than the everybody else in market B, which is the network effect, or this whole thing of they have this outsized impact on everybody else. And so sometimes the best way to find potentials or look for where the supers are, because they kind of radiate from there.
You've written a book that goes deep into this. It's called Superconsumers: A Simple, Speedy, and Sustainable Path to Superior Growth. Tell us a little bit about that book and what a reader may gain from it, who it's for, and how it can help them in their business.
Yeah, it's I think of it as someone who is I think either starting out as an entrepreneur, or maybe you're in a mid-sized, smaller business and you don't have the resources that big companies do, and that it's ironically less for the big clients that I've served over the history of my career, just because what I find is that a lot of what I was doing in terms of big consulting projects, I found a lot of value out of them. I think my clients got a lot of value out of them, but more often than not, you see patterns, and that there are patterns and themes and kind of, lessons and laws of physics kind of like for growth that are relevant to other people, that if you don't have the resources to hire a big consulting firm, this is the book for you, right? In that it's a really easy way to distill, 85% of the answer down. Now, there's a role for consulting firms, and, part of the reason why I left Cambridge a couple of months back was to, just try to take these ideas and proselytize them so that more people could benefit from them without having to spend a lot of money on consultants to do so, just because I didn't think it was necessary as much anymore, right? And that, so if you're, just starting out, maybe you're not in a heavy consumer type business and you want to learn from it, or frankly, if you are in a big company but you're a smaller brand or business and you don't have the get the attention or the resources that the big ones do, then this is another great asset for you, because you get 85% of the knowledge and the learning without having to go through the whole rigmarole there. So it's a little bit for the underdog is kind of who I've written for.
That's really cool. And then when they're ready for that next step, you have what you just mentioned, EDDIEWOULDGROW, which is a new company that you've started around helping people with growth strategy.
Yeah, it's basically I call it a think tank / growth advisory firm, in that I was constantly looking for, whether at my old job at Cambridge or whenever I would talk to headhunters, I would always say, is there a role for me where I could spend half the time writing and doing podcasts like this one, or speaking and thinking about growth, and half my time as a senior partner? And they're like, no, we kind of want you to do the senior partner thing. So I was like, all right, fine. And so I ended up doing my own thing, because I really I love. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, being in a growth situation is so much fun. And I think when companies do it right, there's a real humanity to it that I find really powerful about business. Then, there are business people who grow by, taking on debt and slashing costs and, firing people and making it more profitable. I'm not as into that as it is just, let's just grow the sucker, right?
Yeah.
And what I have found is that I think I can add more value to the business world writ large by writing about these ideas and having companies apply them on their own. Or the advisory part of what I do is, I loved my experience at the consulting firms. And again, they have a great important role that they play, but it's a bit like going to a teaching hospital if you have a mysterious illness, right? Like you go to, famous hospital X and you meet the chief of surgery and you're like, oh, this is great. And then you wake up and then you're like, oh, my procedure was done by first-year med students. And that didn't make me super excited about that, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is like, look, I don't have a huge team. If you're looking for huge data, then I'm not the place to come to. But if you want advice based on my experience and logic and some of these principles, then it's a lot easier for me as a solo guy to help out there. And of course, if you need, more kind of data assets and resources, then I'm happy to send you back to my old friends or, figure out a solution in the middle. But what I have found more often than not is a lot of my longtime clients are leaving big companies to go to smaller, more entrepreneurial, nimble places. And they don't really have the need for the huge data sets and consulting decks that I would create in my old days, because there's less bureaucracy, right? They can make decisions faster. And I was like, you know what? I kind of want to hang out with my old friends, and I don't what's the point? Like, if I know the answer, like, what's the point of wasting time and everyone's money, kind of proving it out to other people? Let's just go do it. So that's part of the whole rationale for Eddie Would Grow there.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful place to be. I think of the companies that we work with and our customers, and just how just having that ability to be innovative, rapid in making decisions, and not weighed down by, oh, there's 20 hoops that you have to jump through before you make a movement and a shift and a decision. Yeah. I think a lot of people just like that ability to say, let's go for it.
Oh, it's huge. And I think it's not only is it more fun and they like it, but it's actually critical to winning going forward, because, speed is going to be that much more important. So
before we jump into our rapid fire questions, I have one last question for you. And it has to do with that business that is maybe a small business, and they've become a medium-sized business. Maybe they have 100, 150 employees, and they want to continue growing, but they've hit that plateau. Or maybe it's an agency that does marketing, and they've gone from a solopreneur, and now they're at 15 or 20 people working for them, and they've hit that plateau of growth, and they've kind of grown stagnant. What would be a step that you would tell them to take so that they can continue their journey of making the business what they want it to be?
Yeah, I would just start having those conversations, right? So find those super consumers of, in a B2C situation of your category, if you're an agency or services, like find your favorite clients that not only have been good to you, but like, these are people that if you weren't in business, you'd still gladly grab a beer with them or have dinner with them or whatnot, right? Like just find people that you would actually be friends with, and just start having conversations with them about like, kind of curious about what life is like on your side when, or just be that much more direct. If you're on an agency side of like, what are the most successful, services that you've ever procured or hired? Right. And though they have, I guarantee you're in a B2B agency situation, they have that top of mind. They know, the most successful things we've ever done were this, and that. Right. Yeah. And then you can kind of learn and say, well, what made it successful and what kind of backed up from there. Right. And so staying with the B2B situation, like I remember earlier on my career, I had made a recommendation to launch a new product, and it did not go well. And the CMO called me in a year later and kind of let me know that it did not go well and that I should feel ashamed about it because they lost money and this and that. And I did feel ashamed about it. I felt really bad. And what it did was I had another bout of soul searching, but I actually took some time to calculate my batting average. I literally went back and took every project that I ever did and figured out like, what did we charge? Did they learn something new? Did they get a new strategy out of it? Did they do something with it? And did they get a marketplace insight or impact out of it? And was that impact, meaningfully larger than what we charged them? And so in that exploration, I found that most of the time, almost all the time, they learned something new, which felt good. And then most of the time they did something about it, had a new strategy or action. But only about a third of the time was it the case that they actually had a marketplace impact that was quantifiable. And I was like, that's good if I was playing baseball, but that, I don't really feel good going into a new client situation. It's like, you're a little less than a coin flip as to whether this will actually make a difference or not. And so I spent my career after that trying to figure out how to improve my batting average and moneyball that number higher. And I think I've been able to do that. And what I realized in part was, the lessons that I took away were really quite fascinating in that it was, it sometimes had to do with what I was doing. But sometimes it had to do with the clients themselves, right? That were they in a situation where they had autonomy to make decisions? Were they backed by resources or whatnot like that? And that it's not always the case that you have the luxury of choosing your clients, but just being mindful of like when you find the right client who's a strong leader who has resources, like you got to double down on those projects and services and put more than what the contract stipulates, because the payback of a testimonial that has had marketplace success is huge, right? And then a third of the time it was not me, not the client, but it was just circumstance, right? The timing of the market and the competitive situation and whatever it was. And so what I began to do was, I'm going to control what I can control and I'll only fuss about that. But when it's a little bit like, counting cards in Vegas. When the deck is hot because I have a good client and they have resources and the market is good too, then I am going to put more of myself into that effort because I believe that there's a payoff at the back end of it.
Yeah.
And it's not to say when those things aren't true that, I do less than a very, very, very good job with it there. But, like in every situation, when you should double down and, when versus when I'm going to do what I've been hired to do. I'm going to do it well, but, I'll be cautious about, investing above and beyond there. So I think that's a B2B scenario, but I actually think it's the similar situation with the consumer set. Like, if you got a super consumer and they have a problem with your product and want to return it, take it back and, replace it no matter what the cost is. It's really important to overinvest in those situations and, but, not do it foolishly where you're just, chasing after people who may not ultimately be with you for the long haul there.
That's really good. How can someone connect with you or find your book?
Yeah, you can find my book on Amazon is the easiest place to find it, or at HBR. And so if you do get it there and you do like it, please leave a review. That's always super helpful. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at EDDIEWOULDGROW, EDDIE or my website and email are eddiewoulldgrow.net or eddie@eddiewoulldgrow.net.
Let's jump into our final section, which is rapid fire questions.
Sure.
What is one step you would tell someone with a big idea and dream and they simply don't know where to start?
I would start with share that dream with a super consumer. And what I find important about that is, you find somebody who is similarly passionate and very much a big spender in the category. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs or leaders with a big vision and dream, you're kind of, kindred spirits there, but you got to find somebody there who's a super consumer, and they'll do a couple of things. They'll either validate your idea or they'll refute it, which is important to, get that feedback early before you invest too much of yourself in it. But more than likely, they'll build on it and help you enhance it in a way that you hadn't seen before. And so that vision and dream that you have, talk about it with other people. Otherwise, it'll stay a dream and not a reality. So talk about it with supers, build on it, refine it, keep talking to them about it, because you know what? They're always going to love talking about it, and they're always going to want to help you make it better.
You've worked with a lot of companies globally. You've traveled the world and spoken at tons of different events throughout the world. What's one area in the world you want to see change?
That's a great question. I would like to see... that's a very, very good question. I would like to see... more of the stories that I saw in Africa and Asia in particular be told back in the U.S. because it's in the Western world, and that what I find is that adversity leads to great innovation, and scarcity actually leads to very creative and ingenious solutions. And from my times there, I've seen some amazing businesses that have emerged, and it's traditionally the case that ideas they emanate from the U.S. and the Western world and go outward there. But I actually think that the world that we live in now today, the odds are stacked in the favor of the small and the nimble and the agile, and that more of those stories are actually happening in the rest of the world and actually have quite a bit of relevance back in the U.S. there.
Wow, that's really cool. Somebody's got to figure out a way to tell those stories.
Yes.
That's for sure. You have done so much in your life already. What do you want your legacy to be?
Yeah, I want my legacy to be that's another good question. It's one around there's that Pixar movie Ratatouille.
Yeah.
One. And the one of the head chef Gusteau, I think his book is the whole idea of anyone can cook, which is I think a controversial statement in light of the other kind of haute cuisine chefs who are like, no, not everyone can cook and the like. But like, I think this idea of, again, the underdog and my greatest joys in business have been categories where people are like, there's nothing going on here. Nobody cares about this and there's no hope. And then you find out, office products and staplers, they're actually a bunch of crazy super consumers who love this category to death, and they spend a lot and they want more. and then you find these amazing growth strategies that occur from, flipping conventional wisdom on its head. And so, if I would love my legacy to be anyone can grow, kind of building off the anyone can cook, and that if you find your super consumers, find that category doubling vision, and then, create a new category to get after it. Like, I actually think it's not easy, but the formula is actually straightforward, and there's nothing more enjoyable than when people take something that everyone has dismissed and overlooked and say, oh, no, there's a there.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. Who or what inspires you?
Yeah, I mean, there's the name of my enterprise, EDDIEWOULDGROW, is actually based off of a phrase from Hawaii. So that I was born and raised in Hawaii, and there's a phrase there called EDDIEWOULDGO. And it's named after a gentleman by the name of EDDIEWOULDGROW. He was a famous Hawaiian waterman, a big wave surfer, lifeguard, and navigator. And he ended up losing his life on the Hokulea, which was an effort to recreate the ancient Hawaiians' celestial navigation that they did, kind of using just the stars. And he ended up their ship ran into trouble and capsized off of Oahu, and he ended up swimming to shore to get help, and they never saw him again. And so EDDIEWOULDGO is the phrase that's named after there's a very famous big wave surf competition in Waimea that they only hold when the waves are big enough, and it's by invitation. So they only invite the top 30 best big wave surfers there. And the phrase is EDDIEWOULDGO because he would, drop in on the biggest waves, but also he would go for help. And so to me, it stands for courage, excellence, and generosity. And, it's part of the inspiration. I figured EDDIEWOULDGROW, it would be meaningful for people from Hawaii or surfers and know that story. ESPN actually did a nice 30 for 30 on EDDIEWOULDGROW. Or it would be at least not boring and make for an interesting conversation starter. So
I'm really glad you shared that story. I had no idea. It's really cool.
Yeah.
What are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
I am listening. I'm a huge podcast Superconsumers. So what I love about it is I think the diversity of podcasts that you can get to, and that are beyond business, so that you can learn and apply them elsewhere, I think is really fun. And so, business wise, there's a good friend of mine, Christopher Lockhead, who runs a podcast called Legends and Losers. And what I love about it is that half the time is spent talking about all the failures that people have had over the years,
wow.
and in the different trials and tribulations that they've had. And, he's obviously bringing on guests who've had, meaningful success in the marketplace. But I just appreciate, Christopher is a great guy who wrote a great book with some friends called Play Bigger. It's done very well.
Yeah.
Published in HBR, and he's dyslexic and he's had his own challenges in life, and I just appreciate how he embraces losing in regards, because I think you just learn so much from it. And you just, it's nice to be around people who are willing to talk about their failures, and because it kind of reveals that you're not so stuck up about it, but whatever success that you might have had. But then beyond his podcast, I think I listen to a lot of the ones on The Ringer, just sports and pop culture and foodies. Like, I think of The Ringer as a bunch of super consumers, be it sports or TV shows or movies, and like a lot of, like, there's one that they have called The Watch with Andy Greenwald and Chris Ryan, that I am not a movie expert. Like, when they go into the technical things, my eyes glaze over, but they're really good friends and they really love movies, and I just enjoy the banter. Like, I just think it's fun, even though I don't get most of it. And then I'm a big fan of, you mentioned Gladwell, his revisionist history podcasts are great learning, great fun. And I think that he has what I always have aspired to, which is the ability to flip conventional wisdom on its head. So
that's really cool. I end every episode with this final question.
Yep.
What is one dream you're still wanting to fulfill in your own life?
I am trying to figure out how to get home. So I'm a homesick, born in Hawaii guy, lives in Chicago. My wife's parents are here and my kids are here, so it's going to be hard to kind of move back. But like, the part of what I've always enjoyed is I think there's a real, beyond just the normal things of what people know about Hawaii, but there's a real special peacefulness that's there that I feel as kind of intertwined with the ocean and the land there. And my hope is to go back home and spend more time that my parents are there, but also figure out a way to run more of my enterprise out of there. Not just because it's cold in the wintertime in Chicago, but like, I just think this idea of like, I'm amazed at where technology has gotten us to, and the ability to communicate, and that there should be an ability to be able to work wherever you want to work and wherever gives you joy, to be successful and productive, but also not compromise, family and friends and kind of the things that give you personal joy there. So I'm trying to figure out a way to design my life in a way that I can do that, and so that it's an inspiration to others, whether it's Hawaii or their version of Hawaii, that they can find a way to kind of break all the compromises in their lives too.
It's really cool. Eddie, thanks so much for taking time out, sharing your story, and such incredible insights into the world of growth and business, and on the bigger scale, just life in general.
Oh, this was tremendous. I really, really enjoyed it, and thanks for having me on, Mike.
I want to thank today's guest, Eddie Yoon, for taking time out to share his story. You can swing on over to EDDIEWOULDGROW.net to find out more about him, or you can swing on over to JumbleThink.com, where you'll find his bio, links to his social channels, his website, and also how you can get his book. Our guest on Monday's episode is Michael Gebben. He is the founder and CEO of Jumpstarters. He has worked with people like Tony Robbins, Pat Flynn, Tim Ferriss, and Richard Branson. In the episode, we talk about clarity. We talk about getting untrapped and making your own way. We talk about metrics for success and what success looks like, and so much more. It's a really fun episode. Make sure you check that out this Monday. At JumbleThink, we believe everyone is created for purpose and destiny, that they're unique and special. And we want to help you on your journey. Maybe you have a big idea and dream, and you simply don't know where to start. Or maybe you feel alone and you just need someone to talk to. Well, we're here to help you. Drop us an email, hello@jumblethink.com. We'd love to start the conversation and help you on your journey to create the world you want to live in. Thanks again for tuning into this episode. It's been a lot of fun. I hope it's encouraged you. Now get out there and do something amazing.
Les mères de famille, les enfants, peuvent également prendre un moment revitalisant dans quelques mois, lorsque vous aurez bien saisi la technique et que vous serez maître de votre corps. Vous pourrez vous décontracter même en travaillant.